I like this Glamdring even more than the first one. It feels fantastic in the cut. So which one is truly the king of all fantasy blades? Hello and welcome back to another episode of Screen Tested, and today we're taking a look at some of the best fantasy sword designs ever put to the silver screen, that being Glamdring and Andúril from the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Now, I'm going to be completely honest with you guys. I'm absolutely in love with both of these sword designs. They're very, very cool. Now, I have done full episodes on each of these swords along with an entire Lord of the Rings playlist. So if you want to check out any of that stuff, you can. But what we're going to be focusing on is the practicality of each of their designs and see if we can come to at least a little bit of an understanding to see which sword might be the king of all fantasy swords. So let's talk very briefly about some of the backstory of these two particular blades to help us understand some of the design, right? So this particular blade here, being Glamdring, was forged for the High Elven King of Gondolin. Yes, this is an elven longsword, if we want to put it that way. Then we have Andúril, or Narsil as it originally was forged by the dwarves. So we have two blades that are for two kings, one forged by dwarves, one forged by elves. So it's completely fair to compare these two blades, one by the elves, one by the dwarves, both forged for kings. Now, these two particular examples here are actually spring steel battle ready blades, meaning they're sharp. We can cut with these. You can actually purchase these if you want. There'll be a link down below. The Glamdring, this is the updated version, which is kind of why I wanted to do today's episode. It has a real blue leather handle, and it also has a folded steel blade. Comes in at around about $269, and the Andúril / Narsil comes in at around about $349. So there's a little bit of a price jump there. Now, with that being said, let's get out there. Let's start swinging them around. I think we'll start with the Andúril. Now, this is an interesting blade because obviously it is actually originally forged by the dwarves. Then obviously it gets broken in the Last Alliance of Men when they're fighting Sauron, and it gets reforged by the elves. So technically both, I guess, made by elves and dwarves, if we want to put it that way. Let's start off with some of its features, right? Because there is actually a lot of design here that is quite good, honestly. Let's start off with the crossguard. So this crossguard does have a little bit of complexity about it, I would say. It's rather refined. We've got these nice, I would say contoured crossguard here, and then we've got these nice flared quillions, which means that, if you catch a blade here, it's not going to fall off. It will get funneled into the strong of your blade, which is good, right? One of the things that I can go either way on personally is this kind of like raised point here, specifically because there's a lot of techniques that you do with a longsword, right, that require you to put your thumb here, and this being directly there is a little annoying, but you can technically put it on the side. It's just not something that I prefer. It's not a big deal, but it is worth mentioning. It's still perfectly functional, right? This crossguard is functional. Then when it comes down to the handle, this is quite a thin handle for such a large blade. More of a, I would say, diamond cross section on it with obviously these leather risers. I think it's really comfortable. Like personally, I think it's really comfortable, but it is noticeably a little thin for this length and thickness of blade. Just a touch more would give you a little bit more grip and purchase on it. Not a huge deal though. Then we get into, I would say, the interesting part obviously about the blade, and that is this, I would say, half handle / pommel kind of integration here, because this is all metal, right? In the hand, it feels good. Like, it feels good. It's made right. It's not sharp. It's got no, kind of terrible grinding on it. It's polished. It's comfortable. It's not the most grippy, I would say, obviously because it is a metal, but you do have that grip because of the leather handle up the top. This is where obviously there is complexity, because how do you make a sword like this with half handle / pommel? It means that you kind of have to get creative with it. I believe this one, because this is a battle ready replica, right? It means that this one, I think, is rather hollow, and then it actually has a split tang in between the eye there. Now, in practice, I haven't had any issue with it. Like, it still functions perfectly fine. It's just very unique, right? Because depending on where you get the sword, how it's made, they're going to have some quirks, because this is kind of an interesting, I would say, pommel handle combination. Then when it comes to the blade is gorgeous, right? I'll try and show you guys. We have those beautiful fullers. Like, look at that. Absolutely fantastic. And it is razor sharp, very, very thin, which means that when you actually cut with it, right, it is fantastic to cut with. Now, the one issue is not the right word. The one kind of pet peeve that usually draws me away from something like Andúril personally, right, is that it doesn't have a profile taper. Now, there's plenty of different blade shapes and designs that don't have a profile taper, but personally, I always gravitate towards them simply because there's a lot of benefits to them. This one being rather, you know, parallel with obviously the tip there. It does have a slight taper to it, I think, you know, at least on camera, it looks like it does to me. It means that it's just not my personal blade, I would say, geometry that I'm into, right? I always kind of go, especially with my long swords, for something with a profile taper. But again, doesn't mean it's not functional and not practical. It's just purely a personal preference thing there. And then obviously we have that inscription running down in the center of the fuller. So overall, right, Andúril is a gorgeous, gorgeous blade that feels really nice in the hand, especially if you have something like, you know, a battle-ready blade like this one is. It means that when you actually cut with it, right, it feels fantastic in the cut, and it also makes such a nice ringing sound simply because we have such a long tang extending inside to a metal handle. It gives it a nice kind of like yeah, the sound that it makes when it cuts. But overall, a fantastic sword, especially for a fantasy sword that is, of course, also practical. Another caveat, obviously, that I should mention is this one isn't as long as the one, obviously, in the films, because it is a long sword version rather than, you know, like a full war sword one that would probably come up to around about here. And there's, you know, there's pros and cons to all of these things. I'm not a big, like, it doesn't bother me personally, but that is obviously something to consider if you wanted one that was, you know, a lot bigger than this one. This one is more in the regular long sword area, which I like personally. As with everything, there is a couple of caveats. If you actually want to pick one of these up, there'll be links to both the Andúril and obviously the Glamdring. You can grab these battle-ready versions, which honestly I recommend. This one is the version 1, so it's a little bit more flexible than I think their new updated version 2, but I've heard that they have strengthened it more, and the only issue that I had with it, if you watch the full episode, the full review, you know that it's obviously just a bit too floppy for my personal preference, but as you can tell, it does still functionally cut and things like that. Overall, I think that is our Andúril. Beautiful sword, beautiful at cutting. If you do it, you know, practically and properly, then the weight balance on it and how it moves is fantastic. Now let's get into the Glamdring, because obviously there's a lot to go over with that one. Hey you, you're finally awake. Have you considered subscribing? If you're not already, of course. It really helps out the channel and I would truly appreciate it. All right, let's get back to the episode. Now, the reason why I wanted to do today's episode is kind of a little bit of an update, right? We obviously did a full review on the original battle-ready Glamdring that we got from Sordia, right? This is the version 2, and this one is incredibly nice. First off, it has a proper dark navy blue leather wrapped handle. I think they've also got like a twisted cord underneath now, so it has a little bit of a texture under there. We obviously still have the same crossguard and pommel combination. These ones seem to be finished a little bit nicer than the original ones, honestly. And then obviously they have options now for this pattern welded / Damascus steel blade, right? And it's very subtle, but in a way that I really like. And on top of that, this particular profile on this one has a really thin waist, which means that it feels like the leaf bladed shapeness is a lot more pronounced on this particular version. Maybe that's just in my head, right? But this version 2 is really fucking nice, is essentially what I'm saying. So, all right. That's the actual sword part. Let's talk a little bit about Glamdring and how it compares obviously to the Andúril. And that is, this one here has a lot more features on it. I would say, not even features, design styles that I personally really like. Let's start off at, obviously, actually let's start with the blade. We have a very subtle leaf bladed long sword, right? Which means that it's a little bit thicker here, a little bit thinner of a waist here. Now what this means in real terms is the point of balance on it when you actually move it is a little bit kind of not as perfect as some other long swords, right? But not enough that it's a big deal, right? It feels like you've got a little bit more chopping power with it because obviously it flares out. But I think this is important to understand that it doesn't feel heavy here and it doesn't make it like a huge chopping sword. Instead, it's just very subtle, right? On top of that, we have that beautiful tip geometry and shape, absolutely incredible. So the blade itself is what I would consider to be like really nice. Like, it's one of my favorites, right? There's a little bit of bias here. I should mention that I love the Glamdring. Then when it comes to the crossguard, it is a slightly sweeping up crossguard. It's not as long as the Andúril, right? So I do think there is a very, real thing there. It's not going to have as much, protective cover because it's not as long, but it slightly sweeps up, which I really like. You make contact with someone's blade, it's going to funnel it straight down into the strong of your blade. Really like that. It does have kind of like a nice little ricasso here, I guess we'd call that, which means that if I want to put my, finger over the guard, it's actually really nice for that. And of course, like I mentioned earlier, if I want to thumb the blade, it also feels really nice with this particular crossguard as well. Then when it comes down to the handle shape and design, obviously this one isn't 100% accurate to the one that we see in the, the films, right? This one is a little bit more oval. Obviously that still means that you can completely, I would say, index the blade properly to be able to cut. But I think the original ones are a little bit more, maybe octagonal. I don't think they're hexagonal. They're just a little bit more angular, right? This one is a little bit more soft on the hands. That's how I would describe it. And then we have a very nice, I would call this a scent stopper faceted pommel. It's not faceted on the top, but it's faceted here, I guess, which is one of my favorite, I would say, practical pommel designs. This is important because, you can have a lot of different designs of pommels and swords and stuff that you enjoy, but it doesn't necessarily mean that when you actually use them, you're going to enjoy them. I think a perfect example for me is like a fishtail pommel. I love the look of fishtail pommels. I don't really like using them, honestly, but this pommel here, for me, personally, is one of my favorite to actually use for a blade. And that's kind of the roundup of Glamdring as it is, right? Those are kind of like the features, the little subtle differences in terms of its shape and geometry and design compared to Andúril. But this one is, like I said, brand new and it is so sharp. Holy shit, that is sharp. So let's do a little bit of cutting while we're out here, see how this one feels, especially obviously comparing it to the original one. Yeah, it cuts really nice. This honestly, I think cuts better than the original one. All right, let's try a couple of bottles. Obviously, this is really just to test how sharp this edge is. Let's see if we can get some actual really clean cuts here. All right, let's try right there. Yep, that is very sharp. Holy shit. Test the tip out. Oh, okay. That tip felt like nothing was even there in the slightest. Nice. One more thrust to a cut. Incredibly sharp. I like this Glamdring even more than the first one. I am really happy with it. Really happy with it. So half swording is one of the areas where this particular blade geometry, I think, beats out Andúril, honestly. When you're fighting someone who is armored, right? We have our armor over there. Being able to obviously grip your blade and, be able to get it into the gaps and all that sort of stuff is really important. And one of the things that I think is a subtlety that I like about this particular blade geometry is because you have that thinner waist section right around here, it means it's actually a little bit thinner and easier to grip, right? And obviously then it flares out somewhat just before we get to the tip that then tapers down to like a fine needle point, right? So obviously with this particular blade profile and geometry, getting into things like the gaps of the armor or underneath actually lends itself, I think, a little bit to this kind of subtle leaf blade shape design, longsword design, whereas the Andúril, because it doesn't really have a profile taper at all, I just don't think it would be the best at it. So I do think that is somewhere where the Glamdring does start to come out on top a little bit. All right, so we've moved these things around. We've done our cutting, we've done our test. We've spoken about the pros, the cons, and the differences between the design of both of them. So which one is truly the king of all fantasy blades? The truth is, objectively speaking, I don't think there's a winner. Now, it depends what type of criteria we apply here. In terms of raw functionality and practicality and the lethality of all of these blades, that being Andúril and Glamdring, they're honestly equivalent. Both of these swords would serve you well in battle. So there isn't really a right or wrong answer here. This one is 100% kind of down to personal preference. Whichever one you gravitate towards, whichever one you would actually functionally use, there's no wrong answer here. They're both functional and practical sword designs. So in my opinion, they're both at number one. The question is more of which fantasy sword design can actually compete with either of these, and the answer is not many, honestly, but I genuinely hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to pick up either of these blades, there will be a link down below, but I'll see you next week in another episode. Have a good one.